The most important thing is that you limit yourself strictly to the 20 minutes. 20 Minuten.
Ja.
Wir haben 4 Vorträge, also das heißt 90 Minuten. Dann können wir eine kleine Pause nehmen und dann eine ganz allgemeine Diskussion zusammen für die 4 Vorträge.
Ja. Okay.
Okay?
Guten Tag.
Guten Tag.
This is me.
Okay, and you are Heinrich.
Ja, Heinrich.
Ja, Heinrich. Ja, schon gehört, dass ich ein bisschen Deutsch spreche.
Ja, das habe ich schon gehört, voller Bewunderung.
Ja, nein, mein
Ich spreche kein Niederländisch, kein Schwedisch, kein gar nichts.
Italienisch sprechen Sie, das habe ich gesehen. Sie können es Ihnen lesen im 15. Jahrhundert Toskanisch. Also, das kann ich nicht.
Tiefstapler.
È già fatto.
Posso chiedere una
Sì.
Allora, prima di iniziare dovremo fare l'annuncio
La comunicazione per
la visita
chi lo farà?
guidata.
Chi lo farà?
Lo fanno loro.
Ok, d'accordo.
E magari lo ripetiamo anche alla fine della mattina.
Sì.
Ok, glielo dico.
Sì, ma io non dovrei farlo, perché io non conosco i dettagli.
No,
D'accordo.
Se loro non...
Ok. Ancora una piccola cosa, Federica. È giusto che tutti gli autori hanno ricevuto il messaggio di limitarsi a 20 minuti.
Sì.
A 20 minuti,
Sì.
Ok.
Abbiamo fatto un bel lavoro durante la notte a abbreviare tutto.
È importantissimo perché ci sono 4 relazioni, quindi...
No, sono tedesco, quindi...
per voi no,
per forza.
Per lei non è
Siamo
un problema.
precisissimi.
Ma ci sono... non credo che siano italiano da noi stamattina, perché con gli italiani è sempre...
No, Raffaele Danna è precisissimo, perché...
d'accordo.
Lui
è perché lui lavora in Inghilterra, quindi
adesso
è già
si
stato
spostato
influsso
a
dal spirito
Pisa, però,
inglese.
Sì, yes, you simply say...
Okay.
Come to an end,
I won't say it after 20 minutes, but after 22, 23 minutes I start becoming nervous, and then I give you a very small sign.
No.
I just kick under the
Eric,
table.
don't get nervous.
No, I never get.
I have a question about the
please.
presentation.
Yeah.
I wrote my presentation on the memory stick and the computer, of course.
These are, I think, the technical guys.
I talked to them.
Yeah. They must prepare it on the computer so that everything is ready when you start, because that can be a main source of problems as well. People come here with a memory stick, it's not adaptable here, and then we lose precious minutes. So talk with them.
I put it into an PDF.
I've done this.
Yeah. Also with the guys?
No, I just... Yeah,
Oh, you have already done
said,
it. Okay.
Put your,
but you can do it because you are the first one.
Yes.
And then of course the second one has to wait on. Okay. When you speak, you can put off, it seems, your mask. I will ask, but because speaking with a mask is very difficult, and very annoying.
It's very exhausting if you have mask. I have to teach with mask on.
Yeah. Well, fortunately, I'm retired. I'm an emeritus, so I don't have to do it anymore. But yesterday, I was responsible for 2 large meetings of many hours here with the Comitato Scientifico, with the Scientific Committee and the Executive Committee, and then always talking in another language, and with the mask on, it's so tiring.
Yeah,
Okay. Heinrich, sind Sie ein Mitarbeiter von Markus? Von Markus Denzel? Nein.
Ja. Im Moment bin ich kein Mitarbeiter von Markus.
Privatdozent, hè?
Ja. Und ich habe ein Projekt in Leipzig.
Okay. Signora. Is it your first lecture, Julia, in another language? No.
No.
Oh,
it's not the first.
well.
But I've always struggled with...
Francesco, sarà qui? Tu?
No.
No.
Dovrei?
Beh, perché non c'è una presentazione online, ma forse ci sono un ventinaio, se non sbaglio, che non è un problema per me, io non devo toccare qualcosa per fare la connessione.
No, dovresti però controllare nella chat che quando c'è la richiesta di domande.
Ah sì,
Fine.
ok, nel chat box. Dove si trova?
No, è quello, mi sa che è quello il computer che deve essere controllato.
Ma lui ha bisogno del computer.
Dopo
le sessioni.
Quando i presenti vengono
d'accordo, durante l'intervallo fare il check nel chat box se non ci sono messaggi. Conosco il sistema, d'accordo.
Comunque io sono qui per qualsiasi cosa.
Sì, ok.
Questo è il PC1 e quello delle presentazioni.
Devo passarla di là.
Sì, però non ho capito se potevo...
Heinrich, moet het mogelijk zijn vielleicht die andere Seite, dass wir la distanza di 1,5 metro?
I will go over there.
Ah, you will present there. Okay.
I don't know.
No, it's up to you.
Place assigned to me.
Well, it's up to you. Yeah, but you will need your computer.
No, I just opened the memory stick. So
Because I will need a computer afterwards for the chat box. Because some 20 persons will follow us online and they will possibly ask questions also.
of course, yeah.
Okay, but normally we should respect 1.5 meters of distance, of course, because when we speak, we are allowed not to put on the mask. You understand? So it's important that we keep some
I
distance.
don't understand.
But I will.
I understand what you're saying.
Ok. Tutto bene, Gaetano, tutto bene, e lei?
Faticosamente.
Ieri sei...
Io purtroppo sono arrivato troppo tardi perché non avevo
me la
previsto.
me la sono detta. Sei già informato
Però io mercoledì pomeriggio non ci sono, io devo andare via.
Allora,
Oggi pomeriggio?
No, abbiamo già trovato qualcuno per presidere la sessione domani e mercoledì mattina, ma non ancora. Allora
Se
dovrei
possiamo
chiedere...
fare un cambio, perché
Forse.
io purtroppo sono in un periodo in cui
capisco.
anche durante le sessioni ogni tanto mi devo assentare.
D'accordo.
Oggi pomeriggio invece è il pomeriggio libero, quindi
Allora c'è una possibilità per oggi pomeriggio normalmente sarebbe Marianne per presiedere la sessione, ma forse potrebbe cambiare. Marianne è appena arrivata. La signora è nera e Marianne, se non sbaglio, d'accordo? E se no, allora sarà io o un altro di...
Adesso ma lei c'è mercoledì, lo sai?
Mercoledì solo per la tavola rotonda, io.
No, dico lei.
Ah, lei normalmente no. L'ha detto. Se lei non sarà disponibile, lei vuoi cambiare.
I ask her.
Ok, thank you so much, grazie. Raffaele? Piacere. Parliamo italiano oppure inglese? Per lei è uguale? Ok. You have a very interesting topic, in which I'm very much interested in myself. As you know, we have just 20 minutes, trying to limit. Normally I say this particularly to the Italians because they have the tendency to develop and so. But since you are living in England and you have been influenced by the English, let's say...
I'm not living in England anymore.
Oh, you're not living in England anymore?
I'm in Pisa now.
In Pisa, so...
Yes.
But I thought you were in Cambridge.
I did my PhD there.
And now you are?
In Pisa, in Scuola Sant'Anna.
Postdoctoral researcher or? Oh, yes. Lucky for you. I thought you had to do
No. I just
the
came
weekly
here.
transport between Pisa and England. Oh, yeah, you just
I
did
was
your
in the
PhD
mountains
there.
yesterday. 10 years driving, very convenient.
And how many years have you worked in Cambridge? 4 years?
4 years.
4 years, yes. Under the direction of which colleague?
Craig Muldrew.
Oh, yes, I know him. Was a very famous Craig Muldrew, yes, of course. Orcas for Midas. I know him very well in the economy of obligation.
Exactly.
It's very well known.
And what I'm trying to say here is going to be much more developed in a book that should be out around this time next year.
Okay. Molto in gamba?
Yes, we switch.
We switch.
So
So you will do this afternoon?
I will be this afternoon.
This
she will
afternoon,
do
and
on
Marianne will
Wednesday.
be Wednesday afternoon.
Exactly.
Marvelous. Grazie, grazie. Yeah, yeah, one of is still missing, yeah. Hope. We'll quickly have a check who it is. Raffaele. Our Japanese colleague from Japan, Seiji Horii.
Should I sit here for the presentation or should I look to the other?
What's most convenient for you?
I can switch.
Well, then stay there, yeah, no problem at all.
Sorry. If you want, I can move between slides here.
I hope this will.
Okay.
Non stanno
In case
lì.
it
3
didn't work,
metri.
It will not work then.
exactly. I can do the assistant.
Hai visto il nostro collega giapponese?
Sì,
Dov'è?
no, seduto là. Ti dico di venire.
Bah, è uguale per me. Hai ancora tutto il tempo, ma dove si trova?
No, seduto si vede, non posso indicare.
Perché io non lo vedo.
Ecco, lo vedi, c'ha la mascherina bianca molto grande. Lo vedi il professor? Oddio, non so che.
Ah, lo vedo, sì.
Gli devo dire
Diciamo
di
alla
venire?
parte destra. Beh, no,
Lo chiami tu?
c'è più no, non è problema. Sono tranquillo che è già arrivato. Ok.
Sì, era qui stamattina prima di.
Ah, d'accordo. Ok, allora.
Va bene così?
Potrei cominciare la comunicazione dalla signora,
Sì.
Ok?
Buongiorno a tutti. La Fondazione ha il piacere di offrire a tutti i partecipanti l'opportunità di una visita gratuita alle opere di restauro della facciata.
Io no.
È acceso. No, nessuno sente. Scusate, il canale di inglese si sente. Can you hear the English translation? Ora si sente l'inglese. Can you hear the English channel?
Il reparto tecnico ha detto extra messaggio, però viene qualcuno.
Ok.
Ok, can you hear the English channel? Is it okay? Ok.
Le cuffie si sentono però noi gli speaker non sentiamo nulla, cioè questa sala
Mi dispiace, non è colpa mia.
scusate.
No, scusi, ha ragione, ma
La sento bene.
questo è il canale inglese.
Canale inglese per gli anglofoni, però gli speaker non sentono se non hanno la cuffia.
No, e ci sono molti che non hanno, diciamo, il microfono.
La Fondazione ha il piacere di offrire a tutti i partecipanti l'opportunità di una visita gratuita alle opere di restauro della facciata del Duomo. Le visite saranno alle ore 17:30 e alle ore 18:30. È necessaria la prenotazione in segreteria. And now in English. The foundation, la Fondazione, is pleased to offer to all participants the chance to have a free guided tour to the restoration works of the facade of the cathedral. The visit will be today at 5:30 and as well as 6:30, but please you have to book the guided visit at the secretariat. Okay? Thank you very much.
Gentili colleghi, cari studenti, cari amici, signore e signori, siete tutti benvenuti a questo.
Thank you very much, our dear friends. Please feel welcome to the first day of our week together that is dealing with the presentation and description of 4 presentations speaking about knowledge and especially the way we can have this kind of useful knowledge having an impact of economic growth in the past. This morning, we have 4 presentations. I think that these presentations will all be delivered in English. So I think that we're now moving and we're now switching to English. Adesso sentite l'italiano. Abbiamo 4 relazioni e cercheremo di rispondere ad una delle domande così interessanti, vale a dire la conoscenza utile e la sua diffusione, come è stata trasmessa e tramandata a livello di individuo e di comunità nel tempo e nello spazio. Quali sono stati i fattori responsabili dell'accelerazione o del rallentamento dell'ammontare della conoscenza disponibile e la diffusione, la sua diffusione. E quali sono stati i meccanismi, soprattutto, che possono aver favorito una situazione che ha permesso, che ha consentito alla conoscenza di essere distribuita e condivisa. E di conseguenza anche le sfide come sono state affrontate. E quindi è il programma di queste giornate, sia oggi che nei prossimi giorni. Bene, dal punto di vista pratico, io propongo quanto segue. Dovremo procedere come segue. Allora, prima di tutto ascolteremo le 4 presentazioni. Credo che ci vorrà più o meno 1 ora e mezzo se ognuno dei relatori rispetta chiaramente il tempo assegnato di 20 minuti. Dopodiché ci sarà una pausa caffè, 20-25 minuti. Dopo la pausa caffè avremo una discussione generale sulle 4 relazioni che sono state presentate prima della pausa caffè. Bene, brevemente vorrei presentarvi la prima relazione di questa mattina. Abbiamo Giulia Bruch. Giulia ha il PhD dell'Università di Colonia sulle cronache urbane del tardo medioevo del XVI secolo, scritte dagli artigiani. Bene, la sua esperienza con questi documenti, con questi artefatti testuali prodotti spontaneamente, sulla diffusione della nuova tecnologia e della nuova conoscenza. Prego Giulia, ti lascio volentieri la parola. 20 minuti.
Yeah.
Okay, I can start. Is it started? Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it works.
Okay, thank you for the invitation to this conference, and it's truly an honor to speak here, and I'm a little bit nervous to hold the first paper, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk about transmission of knowledge and innovation in text written by craftsmen in the 15th and 16th century. In mastering a craft successfully, not only talent and suitability of skills are required, but also solid education. As a rule, the knowledge required for the practice of the craft is passed on in the workshops. This is learning from masters and journeymen who already mastered the craft. The apprentices learned the craft by imitating their masters and journeymen, and by the master correcting at the same time. The knowledge conveyed in this way is mostly embodied and sometimes tacit knowledge, which is difficult or even impossible to write down. Craftsmen are forced to learn this tacit and embodied knowledge depending on the degree of difficulty through countless repetitions of the concrete activity, instructed, if necessary, corrected by the master of his profession directly in the workshop. The different demands on the craftsman were taken into account by different lengths of apprenticeship. Writing obviously has no place in the teaching of craft knowledge. Current research shows that craftsmen in German-speaking countries in the 15th and 16th century would have been very well able to put down in writing their knowledge about the crafting of products and services. In the late medieval times, craftsmen usually went through the city schools, learned to read and write in the vernacular and to calculus. In sum, the skills that craftsmen would have needed to write down their knowledge were given since the late Middle Ages. Why didn't craftsmen write about it? The simple answer is it was not necessary. I hope you can see my presentation. No, it doesn't work. It's not the beginning, just a moment. Okay. It was practical knowledge, which, when put into writing, did not provide any benefits. However, this narrative is contrasted with the numerous surviving craftsman manuals, mainly for building, fireworks, war machines, painting, and barbering. These books convey knowledge about craftsmanship and were made available about personal and over long distances. These manuals were printed early, at the latest in the 16th century, and thus made them accessible to a large number of people. These printed sample books are now also accessible beyond their own craft. The question arises as to why these manuals, important for only a small group and intended to impart specific knowledge, were printed at all, and vice versa. Did the knowledge conveyed there play any role at all for the transfer of knowledge within the craft community and for the application and further development of the technology described there? I will explore why craftsmen started to pass on specific knowledge in their manuscripts. The system did not need this. Innovation takes place in direct exchange. Why do we need these scripts? Does the use of the concept of innovation help to understand the practice of these writings? For this, I asked the following questions. First, which knowledge was imparted to whom via written sources? Second, who wrote the texts and for which audience? And finally, was this transfer of knowledge used for interpersonal exchange, the further development of one's own craft, and the promotion of innovation? This paper is based on 2 case studies related to sources from the 16th century German lands, when we can better grasp the knowledge passed on, know more about its audience and how it was utilized. Writings that convey the knowledge of craftsmen are divided into different source genres, whose classification criteria overlap. Most often the sources are divided into model books, sketch books, master builder books, recipe books, and books in pharmacy, as well as armorers books and fireworks books. All these sources have in common that they can be called professional literature. Since the High Middle Ages, writings conveying knowledge about crafts have been known, first sporadically, then increasingly. The knowledge in these writings is conveyed in textual and pictorial form. The sketchbooks of builders contain information about ground plans, walls, long wall systems, but also about building cranes and mechanical saws. In addition, since the beginning of the 15th century, there have been writings from a focus on warcraft and techniques. The craft writings of the late Middle Ages, to which these warcraft writings can be counted, usually offer a mixture of quite different fields of craft knowledge. The first source for my case study is the so-called Stuttgart-Harnisch-Musterbuch. It is part of a collective manuscript, which is now in the Württemberg State Library in Stuttgart. It contains the so-called Harnisch model book and a partial copy of the dialogues of the Augsburg gunsmith Samuel Zimmermann, a well-known and widely distributed handwriting literary discussion between a master of warfare and a fireworker. In my analysis, I focus on the Harnisch model book as a case study for texts that convey craft knowledge. Warcraft knowledge is conveyed in the manuscript through 85 drawings and text supplementing the drawings. The manuscript was written by the edge painter Jörg Tisorg. The drawings have been dated from 1548 to 1563. The manuscript was made in the early 1560s. The direct addressee of the manuscript is unknown. It is also unknown how the manuscript came into the possession of the Duchy of Württemberg. However, the manuscript was certainly addressed to potential buyers of harnesses. It is no coincidence that such a handwriting was created in Augsburg. The city was considered a leading hub for this product in the 16th century. For further analysis, it is necessary to look at the product, the manufacturing profession, and the buyers. Plating is a highly specialized craft based on experience and extensive knowledge of materials. The armor had to fit, which meant adapting to the various physique. The joints have to be movable and, depending on their function, withstanding physical manipulation. In addition, the appearance of the plate armor should correspond to the current fashion. 4 to 6 masters were involved in the manufacturing process of a single product. Platers worked on the forging, polishers were responsible for smoothing and straightening, girdlers for strapping, upholsterers for the silk lining. Optionally, etchers and gilders were involved to decorate the harnesses. During the period of the emperors Frederick III, Maximilian II, and Charles V, it was seemingly to have their products made in Augsburg, where the emperors bought as well. After 1560, Augsburg lost this supremacy, and in this time of the loss of its supremacy, the Harnisch model book was created in Augsburg, which recorded the heyday of the formerly exclusive court suppliers of magnificent armor. The knowledge conveyed there does not refer solely to the clients owing payments to the etchist. If it were really a kind of order book, it would have contained the cost of the work, but these are missing. In addition, the platters with whom Zorg worked are named. These are all Augsburg master craftsmen, whose fame was known far beyond the city limits, and some of those work has been handed down to us to this day. Maximilian II is a key figure among the clients. He himself is listed only once as a client, but his closest circle also appears there, as well as the Spanish buyers and the Italian ones who were connected to him through his wife, belonging to her of Philip II's court. Clients from the European nobility can be found as well as citizens from Augsburg, the latter with different helmet shape. The clients are mentioned in the inscriptions, and their coats of arms are placed prominently on the side of each figurine. In this codex, knowledge is transported in different ways. The artistry of the Augsburg harnesses is conveyed, and at the same time, Zorg shows through the drawings that what he can do. The illustrated manuscript offers the possibility for anyone who had access to get an overview of what the Augsburg harness makers were able to produce, what forms and finishes were possible and current, and who decided on which form. The manuscript thus not only conveys knowledge about the product and the craftsman's skills, but also which craftsman was able to produce which products or with whom an etching painter worked together. Furthermore, it becomes clear for whom harnesses were made and for whom a special harnesses form and decoration was created. Thus, after which model their own harness could be made, and with it in whose shadow one wanted to place oneself. This shows that the products were not only shown and advertised in a certain way, but also that social knowledge was transported. What was communicated was the inclusion in a social group, in which the potential buyers could also place himself by buying the harness in the latest pattern. But why was this knowledge recorded at all? Is it only social information, or can economic interest be suspected behind it? The Harnisch model book can be read as a kind of order catalogue that advertised the Augsburg harness makers and the etching painter. The time when the manuscript was written gives information about the course of writing, which wrote and drew a representative of the former market leaders of a luxury product. The knowledge conveyed with the manuscript should recruit other clients. My second case study is a manuscript by the Bell founder Christoph Sesselschreiber, entitled Of Bell and Stucco Foundry, Gunsmith Shop, Gunpowder Processing, Fireworks, Lifting and Crushing Equipment, Water and Well Works. Christoph Sesselschreiber, the writer of the manual about bell founding, was the son of the Munich painter Gilg Sesselschreiber, who had been court painter at the court of Maximilian I since 1502. Gilg Sesselschreiber was commissioned in 1508 to lead the casting work of Maximilian's tomb in Innsbruck. Christoph Sesselschreiber had apparently acquired sufficient knowledge of bronze casting in the foundry run by his father to make his own castings. Thus, in 1519, he cast the bell of Salzburg City Hall, and in 1521 the bell of Arnsdorf. Christoph was presumably active in Salzburg between 1518 and 1521. It is known whether Christoph had a fixed location where he carried out the commissioned work, or whether he is to be assessed as a traveling gun founder. It was assumed that Robertus Valturius de Re Militari or the German Vegetius were models for the technical drawings, and the anonymous of the Hussite Wars for the diving figures, the latter of which maybe was available for inspection to Sesselschreiber at the ducal court. Similarities between illustrations from the two manuscripts are undeniable. Whether a direct dependency can be derived from this requires further research. The illustrations, which are very similar in both manuscripts, can also be found in Konrad Kaiser's Bellifortis and probably in other manuscripts as well. Because the manuscript has not been edited, the analysis of the content must be more detailed. The book can be divided into several parts, as already the title preserved in the library shows. The first part deals with the foundry of bells, casting places, casting tools, cross-section of a bell, table with all thicknesses. Knowledge is conveyed both in pictures and as text. The foundry session also covers piece foundry, which includes crafting of guns, pipes, and bullets. The next part describes the operation of the guns using tools such as setting scales. This part is also interspersed with cords of arms. Next are techniques of calculating flight altitude and range and necessary instruments. The following are lifting and crane devices, some of them very complex, which a bell and a gun founder urgently needed for his work. To transport bells and guns or to install bells and towers. In this part of the context, knowledge is conveyed not only on a textual and pictorial level, but also on a haptic level. Sesselschreiber depicts complex pulleys with the aid of cords. Instead of drawing ropes, he threads cords through the codex. The following two parts consisting the recipes of powder and military and civilian fireworks, siege weapons, and divers certainly go back to other written sources. Independent is the last part of the manuscript, which contains knowledge about the construction of water heaters and bathhouses, waterworks for fountains, as well as cast decorative fountains. The constantly recurring cords of arms of the patrons, which also await a more detailed analysis, do not indicate patrons of the manuscript, but provide information about the products made by Sesselschreiber, which brings the manuscript into clear relationship with the Harnisch model book. Sesselschreiber can thus show his repertoire and announce himself. He describes not only what he can theoretically produce, but what he already created. Conclusion. The case studies show that craftsmen passed knowledge in manuscripts. They conveyed knowledge in written, pictorial, and partly haptic form. They addressed the knowledge to the craftsmen of their own craft, who partly received the writings and compiled them into their own writings. Current fashions and innovations are conveyed, but the writings do not provide the knowledge on how to make the products. The transmission of this knowledge remains in the workshop. It remains practical and oral to this day. A platter, however, can very well recognize from the Stuttgart model book how many parts on an armor has and which parts are currently used for which armor and how the armor is cut. The edge painter recognized the patterns that are in fashion. A bell founder can read the measurement and do something with them or reconstruct the beam construction for his own lifting gear. An unskilled person cannot do anything with them. At the same time, a potential client's attention can be drawn to the products. These are not display goods. that were first made and then sold, it is certainly no coincidence that all these products are expensive commissioned goods. The etchist also gives samples of his work by inserting his patterns into the drawings. The coats of arms and names in the manuscript indicates that individual products have already been made and tested. The client can also place himself in a line of prestigious former customers by buying them. This is how advertising still works today. Think of the British coat suppliers. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, for this paper, which, apart from the very useful typology of the available source material and some interesting case studies, also focuses on a more wider issue, a more general problem, whether the oral transmission of knowledge between craftsmen from master to apprentice was more efficient than the written transmission of knowledge. Now, the second paper of this morning, ladies and gentlemen, brings us from German military craftsmanship to practical arithmetics, practical mathematics in England and Italy in the late Middle Ages. The author of this paper, Raffaele Danna, currently works at the Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna in Pisa, and on December 18, 2 years ago, he posted on Twitter, and I quote, "I finally submitted my PhD dissertation. It has been a steep climb, but climbers just keep on climbing. In a nutshell, the thesis is a socio-economic history of Hindu Arabic numerals in Europe." End of quotation. Well, see, Raffaele, where your climbing has brought you. On the top of the hill, here at the Latinis in Prato. Allora, avanti.
Can you hear me? Yeah, it looks like it. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this very kind, welcoming introduction. I was not expecting the... so really appreciate that. And I wanted also to thank everyone who's here and also everyone who's following online. And it's a great pleasure to be here at the first panel. And finally to be back in presence to actually discuss with scholars and students and colleagues, etc. So what I'm trying to do with this presentation is to give you an outline of the paper that I submitted for this conference. And I guess what I'm mainly trying to do is to sort of propose a hypothesis. What I try to say is that if one follows the story of practical arithmetic used by practitioners, one can observe quite a few interesting parallels between late medieval Italy and late medieval / early modern England. And I think that this is quite interesting just to raise as a sort of an observation, because I guess it speaks to maybe possible connections between the so-called commercial revolution of the late Middle Ages and the so-called little divergence. And I guess this also brings up a further question, which is about what are the differences. So what I will be mostly focusing on in my presentation are the similarities between these two cases. But of course, the question in the background is, well, then what was different, of course, from the point of view of the circulation of knowledge and of practical knowledge. So this is the structure of what I'm going to say. I will say something about the motivation behind this paper. I will say very briefly something about Hindu Arabic numerals and the commercial revolution of the 13th century. Then there are these sort of two case studies. The first one is the so-called early adopter of this kind of mathematics, which are Italian city-states. And then we will look at the late adopter at a distance of almost 2 centuries, which is England. And in the conclusion, I'll try to say something about, again, the commercial revolution and the little divergence. In terms of motivation, well, this entire conference is dedicated to what was the role of, I like the expression, socially distributed knowledge in economic growth in the pre-modern period. And the second broad historiographical debate I am also trying to address is the one about the so-called little divergence between Italy and the Low Countries and the rest of the European continent. And the basic idea is to develop a comparative case study, a comparative study of the adoption of Hindu-Arabic numerals and therefore of the positional numeral system in commercial practices in Italy and England. Very interestingly, I think the structure of my paper is quite similar to what Julia has just given us. So I have two main manuscripts and I try to link them to further developments, like broader developments. In terms of contribution, I think this is a close study of the economic role of socially distributed knowledge, long-run observation period, and I think it is also interesting, and I think that also Julia is going in this direction, that we both try to address the question of the economic role of knowledge in the pre-modern period as a question that is in between economic history and socio-intellectual history. And in this, I think we are both following a call by Joël Mokyr himself, who in one of his writings was calling for a closer integration of these two fields. And yes, the idea is to use Hindu-Arabic numerals as this sort of yardstick to guide us through all of these processes. I don't think I need to spend much time on this here with you today. The only thing that I will say is that the merchant bankers who developed all the innovations of the commercial revolution of the 13th century were also the first European economic agents to use Hindu-Arabic numerals in their commercial practices. And this is, in my opinion, not always stressed in the literature. And this is why I think this is an interesting case study, because practical arithmetic with Hindu-Arabic numerals was a very important component of this sort of bundle or package of innovations that appeared with the commercial revolution of the 13th century. Starting from the late 13th century, we have the appearance of the so-called tradition of abacus mathematics. The name is a false friend because abacus manuals do not deal with abacuses. They actually deal with Hindu-Arabic numerals and with their practical applications. The entire tradition can maybe be considered as a sort of a vernacular reception of Fibonacci's mathematics. I'm not saying that Fibonacci was the originator of this tradition, but I'm saying that his text is a sort of very early source to study this kind of knowledge, and to see that this kind of knowledge was being transferred across the Mediterranean into Europe. The mathematical contents of these texts are usually the introduction of the positional numeral system. They show how to do operations with integers and with fractions. They use the rule of 3, which is basically a proportion where one term is unknown and it is calculated from the other 3. They have a range of mercantile problems. Some of them have a practical geometrical section, and the most advanced of them have a section on algebra. And this is interesting because actually, until the 16th century, the European tradition of algebra developed within this practical and vernacular tradition. And these texts are interesting because they were teaching and learning devices. They were developed within schools, and they were very likely used to teach and to learn this kind of mathematics. So their circulation was within the so-called abacus schools, which appear almost in conjunction with these texts. Here you have two engravings. The one on the left is clearly from Germany. The one on the right is from the first manual published in printing in Florence. And they both show that the kind of the context in which these texts were circulating was a sort of learning context, right? This is a picture to show you that the system was actually quite developed in late medieval Italy. This is a picture of the city center of Florence. I don't know if you see, yeah, you see that. Oh, sorry. This is where Santa Maria Novella is. This is where the station is today. This is the dome. And here I have inserted a pin to signal every place where we have direct archival evidence that a practical arithmetic school was active in the 15th century. So this was a very developed system, and interestingly, it was people who would go to this school before moving on to the apprenticeship stage. So it really was a foundational kind of knowledge. And Abaco schools were founded in most central and northern Italian cities. Of course, Florence is possibly the most significant and important case. Here, as I was saying, I have a manuscript to share that I think is sort of exemplary of what was going on in 14th century Florence. It is Paolo dell'Abaco's Trattato di tutta l'arte dell'abaco. It was probably the most successful abacus manual of the 14th century if we measure success by the number of extant copies. It was written by a prominent abacus master who was well connected with Florentine society. We know quite a lot about the life of this man because several other people have written about him. We have quite a few of his works. He is attested in fiscal and other kind of public sources. And possibly the oldest and, in my opinion, very interesting copy is this manuscript that is in the Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale of Florence. I can go much more into detail about this if you want later in the discussion, but fundamentally what this manuscript shows, well, the contents are, it introduces the 10 figures. It shows how to make operations with integers and with fractions. Among the practical applications of arithmetic, one can find problems of conversions. These problems are called ragioni, reasons in a certain way, which comes out of the Latin to reor, which means to calculate, first of all, and subsequently then to reason. These problems concern conversions, calendrical calculations, payments, monetary exchange, alloying, divisions of profits and losses according to quotas, barter, and interest rates. The manuscript also has a geometrical section where geometry is applied to land and architectural surveying. It has, interestingly, an astronomical and a medical section, and astronomy and medicine here are very much linked together because of reasons that on which I can elaborate if you want. And then there is a very broad sort of miscellaneous section where some interesting problems can be found where algebraic methods are used to solve these practical problems. But the main point that I want to try to raise from this manuscript is that it shows that in 14th century Italy, abacus mathematics was a sort of an inherently applied knowledge. So I use the expression a craft of mathematics, right? So it was a mathematics that really was used to solve practical problems. This is a picture of the text. These are multiplication tables. You see 2 and 2 is 4, 3 and 3 is 9, and so on. If one tries to trace out the social circulation of this kind of mathematics, one sees a growing sort of social spread of this knowledge in Italian society. In the 14th century, Paolo dell'Abaco's manuscript shows that this mathematics started off from the commercial setting, but then it sort of started to spill over to medicine and astronomy. And we also know that Paolo, so the author, was active as a mathematical practitioner, that he was active as a consultant for the commune, as a physician, as an astronomer. And interestingly, we also know that he made use of instruments, of astronomical instruments, which he himself built. So he was also some sort of craftsman. In the 15th century, there are quite stunning examples, I think. In the 15th century, abacus mathematics spilled over to painting because it was the mathematics that grounded the development of linear perspective. And I think that a definite example is the fact that Piero della Francesca, one of the masters of this technique, wrote himself an abacus treatise. it also spilled over to architecture, and we know that Filippo Brunelleschi and Leon Battista Alberti in several, from different sources, but we know that they were both sort of influenced by this kind of mathematics. It also spilled over to naval architecture. There is this wonderful manuscript by Michael of Rhodes where we see that the measurements to build a ship were measured using Hindu-Arabic numerals, basically. In the 16th century, I have in the paper this quote from Gerolamo Cardano's Artis Arithmeticae Tractatus de Integris, which is, of course, an exaggeration. It's part of a preface, but it sort of pictures a society where this kind of mathematics was widely circulating. If one looks at England, we see similar developments, but much shifted in time, at a sort of 2 centuries difference, 2 centuries distance. And this is quite stunning because we know that Italian merchants who knew this kind of mathematics had been active in England since the 13th century. But it's also interesting that the relationships between these communities had been quite tense for quite a long time. And here you have a couple of sources that show really the I don't know, let's say heated competition, at least, between these 2 communities. There are some studies about when and where Hindu-Arabic numerals appear in English accounting sources, and this appearance is quite late. They started to be common in the 17th century. So this is something that had already been done before I undertook my research, but then I started to look within English accounting sources, and it is interesting that the early movers among English accounting sources are commercial accounts. And even more interestingly, I think, among public accounts, Southampton is really an early mover, and Southampton is a place where there was quite a lot of sort of forced cooperation between the Italian and the English mercantile communities. And then one sees that commercial accounts from English merchants start to show Hindu-Arabic numerals from the 15th century and the late 15th century. So there is the impression that there was a sort of an incipient circulation of this kind of mathematics from the late 15th century among English merchants, which possibly created a sort of an emerging demand for this kind of skills, which led or happened in conjunction with the emerging of the English tradition of practical arithmetic. We know that the first practical arithmetic manuals, which appeared in the 1530s, published in England, were based on continental sources, and in other papers which I have written, I try to show that this was the sort of final outcome of a transmission that started from Italy and slowly moved towards the north of Europe. We also know that the first practical arithmetic masters working in London were originally from the continent. Practical arithmetic schools in England start to be common since the middle of the 16th century. I have this quote from this work from Humphrey Baker, where Baker is basically complaining about the unfair competition that he is getting from foreign masters. But the most interesting case is that of Robert Record, who wrote this text that is called The Ground of Arts, Teaching the Work and Practice of Arithmetic, which was first published in London in 1543. This text is extremely important for the European tradition of practical arithmetic and for the English tradition of practical arithmetic, because it really was the text that made the tradition take off. In terms of contents, the text changed quite dramatically with time, and this I think is also interesting. The first editions show a very basic text. Record shows how to do numeration, so how the positional numeral system works, and then he deals with calculations with integers, and he stops there. And then he also shows how to make calculations with the counter abacus and with finger reckoning, so with alternative reckoning systems. Starting from 1552, the text becomes more complex, more advanced, and Record added calculation with fractions the rule of three, and a set of practical problems. Then there were other editions after Recorder's death, which were edited by John Dee and by John Mellis, which become more and more elaborated, and the final ones also have a treatment of bookkeeping. The text was successful. It was reprinted over 40 times until 1699, and it was followed by a strong tradition of English practical arithmetic. Also in England, we can see the sort of spilling over of this kind of knowledge to other fields. Robert Records himself is a very interesting case study, or a very interesting example, because after writing his practical arithmetic, he also wrote a text on medicine, a text on practical geometry, a text on astronomy, and one on algebra. And quite often these texts were the first texts to do so in the English language. The majority of the surviving English manuals of practical arithmetic have marginalia that show that these texts circulated among practitioners and were actually used as teaching and learning devices. There is extra-textual evidence of the fact that manuals, and especially a Recorder's one, were circulating among mariners in the 16th century, especially after the attack of the Spanish Armada in 1588. There was a sort of wave of publications about the military applications of this kind of mathematics. And starting from the late 16th century, it is possible to identify what historians of science have called the culture of the mathematicals. And here I have this quote where which says that this culture, which was associated with craftsmen and practitioners, was characterized by a shared, and I quote, perception of mathematics as a vernacular, practical, accessible, and worldly activity. In the 17th century, we see that this knowledge was spreading upwards in the social ladder, and here I have two quotes. One comes from Samuel Pepys' diary, where Pepys recorded that after his appointment as a clerk of the Royal Navy, and after his education in Cambridge, he started to learn mathematics from a sailor. He says it here. He says, "By and by comes Mr. Cooper, mate of the Royal Charles, of whom I intend to learn mathematics, and I do begin with him today, he being a very able man," etc., etc., etc. This is an adult man who started to learn these kind of things, a learned man who started to learn these kind of things from someone lower in the social ladder in the 17th century. And the second, I think, quite striking example is John Wallis, who is one of the founding fathers of English algebra, who says that he came to know about this kind of mathematics not during his studies in Cambridge, but when he came back home during a Christmas vacation, and he saw that one of his brothers, who, as he says, was in order to a trade, and therefore he was attending some kind of vocational school, was learning this kind of vulgar arithmetic, and that is where John Wallis started to be interested in that. And he says that here, where is it? He says that for mathematics at that time with us, we are talking about the early 17th century, were scarce looked upon as academical studies, but rather as mechanical, as the business of traders, merchants, seamen, carpenters, surveyors of land, or the like, and perhaps some almanac makers in London. I think that he is picturing here a kind of society that is quite close to the one that Cardano is depicting for 16th century Italy. So in conclusion, the question is, are we looking at two different phases of the same innovation cycle? Because in both cases, we can see that the adoption of practical arithmetic in vernacular context was driven by needs stemming from commercial practices. We see that this emerging demand of practical arithmetic was subsequently institutionalized with the foundations of practical arithmetic schools. Then we see that in turn, these schools acted as a sort of accelerator in the social circulation of this kind of knowledge. At the center of these schools are these lay practical arithmetic masters who are not directly part of academia and gave practice a key role in their epistemologies. And in both cases, I think we see a process of change that sort of developed bottom-up and eventually reached the higher levels of society. This is it, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Raffaele, for this nice presentation on the slow diffusion process and the spread of Hindu-Arabic numerals in two completely different cultural environments, and also for connecting this problem of adoption and spread with more wider problems, such as the commercial revolution of the 13th century, coined by the late Raymond de Roover, and even the not the great, but the little divergence in Europe. So many thanks for your presentation. I would like to introduce the next speaker with a reference to the Produttività by Carlos Layena yesterday, where we were taught that governments could stimulate the spread of useful knowledge using a great variety of tools and policies. One of these instruments were the so-called prize competitions. Prize with a zeta, not with a C. Prize competitions to promote new technologies, new products, new solutions for technological problems. And these prize competitions are central in the paper by Seiji Horii. And I'm apologizing if I'm mutilating your name, the pronunciation of your name, too much, since my Japanese is not that well. Seiji holds a PhD from the Graduate School of Economics in Kobe University, a university I'm very well familiar with, since it has a long-standing relationship with my own university in Leuven, of course. May I invite you to present your paper? You can put off your mask when you speak, yes.
Can my computer to...
Oh, you should ask in these. You haven't done it yet? The PowerPoint
yeah,
is not ready?
Yet, so.
Also the guys. Okay.
Do you have a USB stick? No, so maybe it's impossible to use it because of the
Copy to the USB stick.
Okay.
You can use this one. This is mine.
Yes.
And if you want to sit here, I can move to the other side so that you can flip through it. Oh gosh, I would not know how to do that. Yeah, yes, that one. I will delete it afterwards, so no worries.
There's no secret involved.
No, just insert it here, yeah.
20 minutes.
This one?
Yeah.
Then you do this, and where is it? Here. And you just flip through it. You can sit here if you want.
When will it be on screen? When will it be on screen? The PowerPoint?
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry for my poor preparation. Okay. Hello, everyone. Okay. Thank you all very much for inviting me from Japan, and you are coming today. I'd like to thank you for giving me a chance to speak in Prato. My name is Seiji Horii, and I'm a lecturer in Chiyogaku University. Before that, I belong to Kobe University, and in today's presentation, I'm hoping to give you an overview of my research. My talk is divided into 5 parts. Section 1 will harness major points in order to briefly understand my research. And then Section 2 will explain textile industry and enlightenment in Saxony and review the previous studies. And Section 3 introduces historical materials. And Section 4 discusses prize competitions during the late 18th century. This is my main part of my presentation. And finally, conclusive part is about knowledge diffusion in Saxon textile industry. Okay, and first 3 major points. And my research question is how knowledge dissemination in the Saxon textile industry in the proto-industrialized region was achieved. So we should understand the German industrialization as a long-term processes since the late 18th century. And in my research, I will focus on prize competitions. Prize competitions in 18th century Saxony was implemented as economic policies in order to recover from the devastation by the 7 Years' War under the German Enlightenment. And this economic policy aimed at having people manufacture high quality or equal to foreign quality textile products. And then I will focus on who could manufacture such kinds of high quality products, who achieved. And most achievement is done by the workers who had already engaged in textile industry. Okay, next I will explain the introductory part. And maybe firstly, I should explain what is prize competitions. Prize competitions promote seeking solutions to industrial, academic, or social issues from the public at large, and the amount of prize to be paid to the proponent of a solution should be informed in advance. So I can say specifically, if you achieve something or solve some difficulties until a predetermined deadline, we will pay you the predetermined amount of money. So prize competition has been implemented until 18th century in a number of European countries: France, Britain, Dutch, the United States, Spain, and Sweden. And not only from textile industry, but also agriculture, environment, energy, society, mathematics, and sea or land route, and the others. Textile industry was very important to understand Saxon economic development and industrialization. Tilly and Copsidis said that Saxony was the first German region to achieve the transition from agrarian to industrial economy several decades earlier than the northern Rhineland and Ruhr area. Therefore, German industrialization must be considered as a long-term process since the late 18th century. In spite of such early industrial development, Saxony had 2 difficulties, the Industrial Revolution and the 7 Years' War. In order to recover from the damage by the event of 7 Years' War, Friedrich August III inherited his father's willingness to support science and the dissemination of knowledge. Based on this concept, in Saxony, 2 organizations, Deputation and Societat, were founded in 1764, just after the 7 Years' War, and they worked together to implement the system of prize competitions. And next, previous studies. Rudolf Vorwerger was the first authentic Saxon economic history research and mentioned the prize, not prize competitions, again and again. And he only described who received and how much prizes were given in the individual cases, so the overall picture was extremely vague. After his research, I here reconstructed part of prize winner list, and however, no page numbers are given as a historical sources. So, and I cannot find any data in the indicated resources. And after his research, Xork and Stebe and Shene also mentioned the prize competitions based on his research. And however, the contents of prize competitions were not discussed in detail. So this is the purpose of this presentation. Knowledge dissemination and quality improvement in proto-industrialized regions in Germany, such as improvement of product quality or the introduction of Jenny spinning machines, has been described as a natural, but is it true for me? The acceptance of knowledge was achieved through the implementation of reforms from above in government and the existence of human infrastructure or human resources to accept knowledge we need. And therefore take Saxon prize competitions as a case studies, and how it functioned is examined the followings. Okay, to investigate such purpose of my research, I used suitable historical materials. And in Hauptstadt Dresden, I read these materials. And what's inside look like this. And take an example. Here is all, this one. Here is the all amount of prizes, occupations, name, and residence, and content of achievement, prize number, and for which prize competitions. Yeah. And overview. And these are main parts of my research based on those historical materials. And prize competition was not always the same content throughout the late 18th century. It was updated timely 1764, 66, 67, 70, 78, 80 to 88. The last one, 88, was varied until the beginning of the 19th century. In fact, 31.4% of prize competitions related to the textile industry. And then I will investigate the political intention of two organizations. But until now, I can't find any historical materials on their policy-making processes. So therefore, I inferred their intentions through investigation of the sentences outlining prize competitions. In 1764 prize competitions, most mentioned raw materials were wool or linen. It's like traditional materials. In the case of wool, many processes were covered, such as raw materials, harvesting, brushing, spinning, weaving, fulling, dyeing, and finishing. Also, for linen, raw material harvesting, spinning, and weaving were covered. And bleaching, lace making, and twisting was also included, but no specific raw materials were referred to. And silk and nettle weaving were also included, but it was unusual ones. And table 4 and 5 shares almost the same content. The production of telch by weaving silk, which is not traditional materials in Germany, and the harvesting of traditional linen and domestic wool, and the production of cambric and batiste. In 1766, twisting of twillon, and in 1767, fulling were identified as different contents. Table 6 shows significant changes. First, cotton was identified as a new raw material for the first time. In addition, 4 cases of only for dyeing were set up. And furthermore, the harvesting of silk raw materials was also added to the prize competitions. And the traditional raw materials harvesting of linen and cannabis was also still set. And as demonstrated in Table 7, most of them in 1782 were the same as in the previous ones. As for the manufacturing processes, raw materials harvesting, spinning, weaving, freeing, dyeing, and finishing were mainly covered. Even so, bleaching, concocting, drawing, and silk threading were added to the list. Moreover, a prize competition to produce new products across various processes and products was held. This would continue by the beginning of the 19th century. This prize means that the targeted processes became more diversified. And finally, Table 8 provides an overview of the prize competitions published in 1788. First, 4 prize competitions were independently related to silk production or silk supply. Additionally, there were 2 bleaching ones for cotton and linen, and 3 prize competitions were conducted for spinning, sock knitting, and manufacturing of steel. And I found another findings when I investigated the sentences outlining prize competitions. 4 commonly confirmed terms in the sentences. This is section 5 in the paper. Collectively, first one is intended to award prizes to the best prototypes. And the phrase first one was found in more than 80% of setting sentences. Meanwhile, the second one is one of the most characteristic expressions of the Saxon prize competitions. The use of this expression was intended to award prizes to those who can produce prototypes of the same quality as foreign products. And the educational prize competitions categorized in third one were set in 1764 and 88, and they aimed at the children living in some orphans to produce twisted yarn or spin linen. Also, they aimed at establishing a spinning school. And finally, the word noi began to be used in this way. Prize competitions for novelty in the textile industry began to be established. And prize competitions often tried to award prize to the most outstanding or best submitted prototypes throughout this period. Besides, when the prize competitions were firstly implemented, product quality required to be equivalent to that of foreign countries, or use traditional raw materials were mainly covered. However, after the 1780s, the authority demanded novelty and new raw materials such as cotton and raw materials for silk. And next, by whom and how were these achievements made? This chapter will examine who accomplished them. And the following is a discussion on the prize winners for which the occupation is known based on table 15. In the 1764 prize competition, the largest number of prizes were awarded to spinners, especially wool spinners. And second most common occupation was weavers, both of whom worked with traditional materials such as wool and linen. Additionally, the following were engaged in the textile industry: 4 textile factory owners, 3 sock knitters, and 1 freeing worker. Meanwhile, 2 merchants and 2 book printers and the public officer were not normally engaged in the textile industry. In 1766 prize competitions, only 3 occupations were known: a textile factory owner, a weaver, and a child. In 67 prize competitions, 10 textile factory owners were awarded prizes, indicating that the prizes were awarded to those who already owned factories. Of these 10, 8 owners were wool weavers, and again the prize was awarded to those who are still working with traditional raw materials. This trend seems to have been maintained in 1770, but dyers and judges were awarded for the first time. Especially concerning the dyers, this may have corresponded to the 4 new prize competitions set in 1770, and corresponding to the changes in the sentences outlining prize competitions, substantial changes also occurred in the 1782 and 88 prize winners. First, an award was given to a royal prize gardener, which had not previously been confirmed. They were awarded in the silk industry, such as sericulture or growing mulberry trees. Next in character were the public officers. Most of them were awarded prizes related to the silk industry. They were not directly engaged in any productive activities, but they were awarded prizes for their efforts to spread silkworm's seed. And the weavers and the sock knitters won the next largest number of prizes, and they achieved some kind of textile production of socks knitting. And the fourth point, and from this period, many occupations that had never been confirmed before began to receive awards, and it can be said that the range of awards winners has diversified. And except for public servants and merchants, few consistent cross-process awards were given, such as spinners to weavers, weaving processes, or dyers to spinning processes. Therefore, the Saxon prize competitions were not a policy of encouraging people to change to new professions, but an incentive to spread knowledge in the professions in which they were already engaged. And let us now consider the individuals who received the prizes. The prominent figures in the Saxon textile industry succeeded in replicating or improving textile machinery, and they received a large sum of money from the Saxon government for their work. And Pfaff and Volker for his wool cutting machine and linen loom. Their contribution was improvement of the quality of machinery and received prizes through prize competitions. However, Matthias Frey and Seiji Ilmscher were never awarded. In addition, Escher was not mentioned in any socks knitting award. They received money from government, not by the prize competitions. In other words, most of the hundreds of awards were given to people who are not considered the most important figures in the history of the development of the Saxon textile industry. The conclusions. Okay, and to deal with the industrial revolutions and damage by the 7 Years' War, the electorate and the government of Saxony implemented an industrial enlightenment-based policy. In fact, a series of reforms and economic policies were proposed after the 7 Years' War. They included the prize competitions discussed in today's presentation. The prize competitions in Saxony in the second half of the 18th century had as its main objectives the production of high-quality products and dissemination of knowledge with its specific intentions, notably the demand for the best or high quality comparable with that of foreign products and the establishment of educational institutions. Many economists might argue that improving the quality of textile goods or introducing machinery in economically backward countries was not so difficult at the beginning of industrialization. However, this is saying so easy but doing so hard. In implementing a prize competition or any policies under the industrial enlightenment, the government must properly assess the situation of the country, and the policy taken can also find its meaning when a certain intellectual base or knowledge base in the industry, that is the existence of workers in the industry, has already been confirmed. Okay, this is the reference, and finish. Okay, that's all.
Thank you, dear colleague, for your paper discussing the apparently many dependent and independent variables that were needed to make prize competitions successful in stimulating the dissemination of knowledge in a specific industrial area or country. I'm now going to turn directly to the last presentation of this morning, which is a case study on Matteo Brandolini, a bookkeeper, of an important and wealthy investor and landowner. This is an important paper that we should keep in mind when we are going to listen tomorrow to the overview by Marcus Denzel, since I have the impression that both papers are more or less tackling the same problem. I should not forget to mention that Heinrich Lang, the author of this paper, is currently a lecturer at the University of Leipzig. Heinrich, the floor is yours.
Yeah, okay, that's working. Oh, thank you very much. I'm very happy to speak here today. I first have to say that I slightly had to modify my talk, so it's about what you have been saying, and the paper I submitted was slightly different. And this maybe is the reason why we have why I'm not speaking directly after Raffaele Danna, because I'm taking up what he has been saying in another sense. And I'm trying now to set up my presentation. Come faccio se voglio fare tutto intero?
Non funziona?
No, non funziona, però non so come modalità schermo interno.
Sì.
Ok, grazie. On December the 6th in 1518, the Florentine Leonardo Spina, who was the director of the Salviati Company in Lyon at the time, wrote a letter to Bartholomeus Welser and Mitverwandte in Augsburg and refers to some transactions operated during the previous fairs. In the same context, he reviews the accounting techniques employed by his fellow merchant bankers from Augsburg. And I quote, you may read in Italian, and I give the English translation. Quote, "We have noticed that the ones which keep your books are not able to cope with many accounts in the future. They have to open 1 or 2 accounts, as you have said. Sometimes you cannot proceed in another way because different accounts refer to different things," end of quote. This quotation is one of the very few occasions when we learn about the transfer of accounting techniques explicitly. Spina explains to the bookkeeper of the Welser Company how accounts should be kept. We knew from the letters he received that the Welsers did not distinguish into various accounts, what actually should be put to different accounts. In this case, we may observe an apparently one-way transfer of a more complex understanding of accounting from a Florentine merchant banker to a South German business friend. This paper considers useful knowledge in the accounting perspective. In doing so, I will present a case study drawn from the Salviati archives in Pisa and in the Vatican. The Florentine son of a papal banker, Alamanno Salviati, did never actively run a business in banking or commerce. The particularity of Alamanno's account books is not only their complex organization, but also their comprehensive consistency. The ledgers are structured by all accounts necessary for a full double entry bookkeeping. They are entirely balanced as well. His account books shed light on his style of life, on Alamanno's style of life, and above all on his investments and the return. In my paper, I'm following the Florentine track down to the 16th century. The hidden figure, key figure, and protagonist here, which abundantly appears in Alamanno's account books, is Matteo Brandolini, who was, at that time, his bailiff, trustee, and accountant. The general question is on Matteo Brandolini, the bookkeeper. Was Matteo Brandolini a clerk which pushed forward a capitalist's affairs? Was he a simple accountant, not much more than a scribe? How was useful knowledge induced to Alamanno Salviati's accounting? In the following talk, I will first expand on the concept of useful knowledge and accounting techniques. Then I will concentrate on my case study. Finally, I will draw a conclusion and highlight the new expert, as I call him. When Joel Mocker introduced useful knowledge as an agent of cultural change, which broke path to the concept of economic growth and hence the rise of capitalism, he referred mainly to technological knowledge. The Western European culture of enlightenment was at the core of preconditioning the Industrial Revolution, leaving behind obstacles of religion. Mocker, though, neglects accounting as a technological business and as useful knowledge. This blindness towards accounting is quite amazing, because in the end, it was accounting techniques to measure economic growth. Some scholars, like Max Weber or Werner Sombart, identify accounting by Western rationality, which made the difference. In this context, a recent study should be reconsidered within a more useful knowledge perspective. I'm talking about Michael Zakim. Michael Zakim has told us the story about the rise of an entire social class of experts. He describes the professional group of the clerks as the engine which made the capitalists' enterprises run. In fact, we are talking about thousands of men at white-collar working places which expanded in the first half of the 19th century. Here, we trace back the arrival of the clerks down to the 16th century. Hence, the culture of knowledge here was the situation before academic teaching of economics, and this is my point of reference or the comparison to make to the previous paper. And thus, before the professionalization of the clerk, which was still to be born as a social figure. Jakob Soll analyzes note-taking as the key competence to systematize knowledge and comes up with commercial accounting. However, Jakob Soll does not view accounting as a kind of useful knowledge in its own. Moreover, he refers to manuals of the 17th century to describe the instrument of commercial accounting as a technique which interferes with other note-taking methods. Moreover, the Florentine context is very particular with regard to the interdependency of accounting and useful knowledge. In order to profoundly understand the accounting of the Florentine 16th century, we cannot rely on manuals. Indeed, we have to analyze account books themselves to trace the bookkeepers and their useful knowledge, which formed the accountancy of that day. On the one hand, techniques were highly refined by then. On the other, apparently every young Florentine who became to be a merchant, an artisan, or even the patrician's son and general, studied the algebraic techniques to all extent at the Abiko schools, as we learned, for 3 years when they were aged 10 or 11. That was before their apprenticeship. These schools, run by masters of algebra, did teach the arts of reckoning. Many of the masters of algebra wrote manuals, as Raffaele has told us, where they summed up arithmetical problems. This particular category of writings, like the Pratica d'Aritmetica by the Florentine Francesco Galigai, which was published in 1521, and many times reprinted, present an enormous number of arithmetical problems as their European exchange rates between currencies and gold and silver at different alloy, in the calculation of proportions of prices to different qualities and volumes. However, these books do not contain any lessons of accounting in the strict sense. If there were any Florentine bookkeeping treatises included in these arithmetic works, they should have been presented like the bookkeeping treatise published by Luca Pacioli in Venice in 1494, as a part of his Summa de Arithmetica. Of course, the title does not lead directly to the topic in question. As far as we can see, Pacioli did not make use of Tuscan sources for his considerations on accounting. Probably there were none. And I come to my second point, my case study. Matteo Brandolini's hand appears in Alamanno Salviati's account books from October the 1st in 1535 onwards, when he opens the new ledger B, the Libro Debitori Creditori Segnato B, which belonged to the 25-years-old Alamanno Salviati, seems to be the first professional account book of the series. And I'm showing here to you the book and the first page. According to his hand in Alamanno's documents, Matteo Brandolini stays with his master till the 1550s. So we're talking about a 20-year span at least. Over the years, Matteo Brandolini became Alamanno's bookkeeper, minister, administrator-in-chief, and proxy. In 1540, for instance, he opened an account book due to the return on the shares Alamanno and his brother's heirs, Redi di Lorenzo, held with their distant cousins Compagnia in Pisa. And I quote, "This book belongs to Alamanno," and I present the Italian text here. "This book belongs to Alamanno and the heirs of Lorenzo di Jacopo Salviati, where accounts are kept by me, Matteo Brandolini, regarding everything which refers to the return from the bank of the firm of Averardo Salviati Compagni in Pisa, due to the said Alamanno and heirs of Lorenzo's. Be it to our body or to our soul on the return from today on," end of quote. In another ledger, we learn that the book was a tavola, a table to keep account of the return on the capital invested. In some delicate cases, Alamanno Salviati sent his bookkeeper and administrator as a representative of his. In September 1539, Brandolini went to Naples as Alamanno's proxy in order to collect the amount of money falling due to the liquidation of his master's share, which he had inherited from his father Jacopo, the banker of the Pope. By then, we are talking about the remarkable amount of money. Matteo had to receive 1,050 ducati di Carlini on Alamanno's behalf, which he explained in the journal in detail. Matteo Brandolini's impact on Alamanno Salviati's accountancy was not at all insignificant. When he opened the above-mentioned ledger Segnato B in 1535, he elaborated his master's system of accounts and developed a technique of full double-entry bookkeeping. The books of the signatory Shi coincide also in size and decoration with the books of an enterprise of those days. Just before the start of the ledger Segnato C, I'm showing here a picture, in 1539, Matteo Brandolini began to copy the outgoing letters and copied the Ricordi further on. The letters do not differ from any of the letters sent by merchant bankers. By writing letters, the merchant banker created communities of practices. Knowledge in that context was continuously referred to in pragmatic terms, implicitly. Of course, merchants had to know what to do and how to do it. But the single transaction was anticipated by explanation in every letter. Matteo Brandolini behaved in the same way. He obviously did not copy letters to learn a businessman's idiomatic language, and he did not try to understand account books anymore. He apparently was well trained at accounting when he arrived at Alamano. Now I'm highlighting my new expert. My conclusion is a conclusion on a concept which derives from the discussion of useful knowledge and accounting on the one hand, and from my case study on the other. In the early 16th century, accountants like Matteo Brandolini appeared in the service of wealthy Florentine households when the patricians started to diversify their investments. Particularly, the combination of various forms of assets which were to treat created the demand for this tiny group of experts. Of course, most of these merchant banker patricians still were active in their business partnership companies, but some of them already tended to only hold shares in the companies of their relatives, like Alamano did. In this case, they were what we call sleeping partners, which kept account books to follow up expected returns on their capital invested. The wealthy patricians from cities like Florence, Genoa, Augsburg, or Nuremberg were the main investors into the loans to European crowns. The capital was transmitted through expanding markets of letters of exchange. The latter were secondary markets to refinance the investments of capital. Especially in this context, the patrician investors did not deal on their own with accounting. Instead, they employed personal accountants which not only kept their books, but also represented their masters in various contexts as proxies or acted as their agents. In that sense, the personal accountant and agent had to coordinate the various fields of activities of their masters. The bookkeeper came to be an expert which had to figure out the chains of investment. What we do not know, of course, is how strict the supervision of the masters like Alamano Salviati on their accountants was. It is rather difficult to judge the impact of the practical knowledge of the masters. The bookkeeper did surely not act autonomously in business affairs. Nevertheless, he was not dependent on his master's advices how to keep accounts. The accountants of the new type became at least the right hands of their masters. In the 15th century, the role of the personal bookkeeper, the household's accountant, was at a lower profile, I think. Of course, there were private secretaries like the famous Sir Alessio Pelli, who was the minister of Cosimo de' Medici's household, as described by Dale Kent in her study on the patron's oeuvre. It was particularly the diversification of investments that made the difference. When the merchant bankers' families became rich by the changing distribution of wealth within society in their favor, they started to diversify their investments. At the end of the 15th century, about 70% of the whole family properties were in businesses and about 30% in land. The situation 100 years later was inverted, and the properties were grown in total. However, the new type of accountants was called in to handle refinancing in terms of accounting. Thus, the bookkeeper left his role as a scribe behind and took gradually more responsibility for the administration of his master's properties. Particularly, this is interesting in the case of bookkeeping on behalf of women. This change in the function from a personal secretary to a personal expert in accounting was a symptom of the evolution which the structure of, within the structure of wealth. Maybe this new type of accountant even promoted the ongoing diversification of investment. For sure, this new type of accountant was not a simple clerk, but an expert in bookkeeping and economic affairs. This is my hypothesis. Thank you very much.
That's because we touch it simultaneously, I think. Thank you so much, Heinrich, for your presentation and your hypothesis on the rise of a new type of bookkeeper in the course of the 16th century. Not a simple or a humble scribe anymore, but a well-trained and specialized accountant, really specialized in the fine and sophisticated art of bookkeeping, of accountancy and financial administration as well. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, after the presentation of 4 papers, I think we need a break now. We shall have a break very shortly for about 25 minutes, 20 to 25 minutes, and I suggest that we will assemble back here at exactly 12:15. Yeah? Oh yes, and before I forget, for those among us who are less familiar or not familiar at all with our, how should I put it, a rather peculiar way of organizing our discussion, let me briefly explain how we intend to organize the discussion. Those who feel the need of a question, of asking a question to one of our presentators, well, they are suggested to come forward and to pick up and fill in one of the forms here present before me, and fill it in very carefully in a legible way so that I can decipher your handwriting, and during the break I will sort them out and prepare your questions for the different speakers of this morning. After the break, I will invite you to come forward behind the microphone to briefly present yourself and to ask your question to one of our speakers. Thank you so much, and enjoy your cup of coffee, Italian coffee or English tea. So that went well. It went well, yeah. Smoothly. Ladies and gentlemen, I must admit I'm feeling rather relieved and very glad that, to see all of you, because apparently I made a mistake in announcing the end of the break at 12:15 instead of 11:15. We are going to have our discussion now on the 4 presentations of this morning. And I have received a lot of questions, and I suggest we'll follow the same order as the order of the presentations this morning. And so we start with the questions for Julia. And the first question will be addressed by Joran Proot. Joran, could you please take place behind the microphone? Introduce yourself in a few words, not your complete CV, just a few words, and then ask your question to Julia. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
No. No. Push the button.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I must say thank you very much for 4 wonderful papers. And they raised, of course, some questions and observations I'd like to share with you. First, for Frau Bruch, Frau Dr. Bruch, for the it occurred to me that you said that in fact the creation of the manuscript or manuscripts took place more or less at the end of the profession, when the profession was perhaps already dwindling down and the industry in which they were working was becoming less important. And it occurred to me that we have a similar situation perhaps in the 17th century, when there's a publication of many books that explain a trade or a specific practice. And I was wondering whether the portfolio that they present to prove their expertise is perhaps not only a way of advertising what they're doing, but also a way of, or an attempt to revive the trade in which they are working. That is a question. Then I also have an observation which has more to do with a comment that Erik Aerts had on Erika's paper. So it occurs to me that perhaps it could be fruitful to look also into cognitive psychology, and more specifically into the work of Michael Tomasello, who has published all his life on the transmission of knowledge, and how knowledge is transmitted from adults to children, for instance, and also intergenerational. And what we see there is that the transmission of knowledge is always, as it is also the case today, a social practice, where several people come together, and in the transmission of knowledge to children, it happens because of the ability to change roles. And there is a parallel in the workshop where the master and apprentice change roles. The apprentice not only listens to what the master says, but imitates. And so I was triggered by your comment, Professor Aerts, because you said the oral transmission was much more efficient than the written one, which is perhaps true, but it is also the physical presence, and so Erika stressed that it's not only seeing, but also the haptic actions. But I would underscore it's even broader than that. It is also cultural, and cultural in the sense that also elements in the training are copied, or learned, are copied, elements that are not merely functional and sometimes make no sense from a pragmatic point of view, but they are part of the entire cultural learning which is specific to human beings. And as far as I've read the papers thus far and listened to the contributions, I think the cultural dimension of transmission of knowledge should also be included into the analysis.
Thank you. Just one small addition. My statement was not a thesis, a rigid thesis. It was meant as a question.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay,
yeah, I know.
Yeah,
a rhetorical one, perhaps.
For 50%, yes. Thank you so much, Oriana. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you.
No, just wait. The other questions. We have another question for Julia by Marianne Kowaleski. Marianne, please. You answer afterwards in the package.
Hi, I have an observation followed by a question, so just be patient. Thank you very much for an interesting panel of papers, particularly Julia's paper I found interesting for the typology of sources that you provided. And my question is really on recipe books, which is one of the sources, and I suspect you have not done a lot of work on recipe books, but I was intrigued by both the similarities and the differences. So similarities, that these are both written texts that are meant to disseminate knowledge. The recipe books are written in the vernacular, but originally appear in Latin. They sometimes include drawings, and they're often recopied. I mean, they're very clearly, you can track the dissemination of specific recipes over sometimes centuries. But there are also some significant differences. The audience is different. It's a domestic audience as opposed to the craft urban audience that you're talking about. There are many more women owners of these manuscripts, and many of the texts, especially the medical recipe books, and are oriented towards recipes for women's health care, right? I mean, there's also cooking and ones about kind of how to domestic. You think of the Ménager, the Good Men of Paris, you know, how you clean your house, things like that. So there's a range of these recipe books. But one of the most interesting things is that they're much earlier than the manuals that you're talking about. So you see these recipe books by the 12th century. So here's where my question comes in. Is there a possibility of cross-fertilization within this genre of these instructional manuals, these practical, that some of the earliest versions, even though there are differences, the recipe books, may have been, they're so widely known, would the later Craftsman manuals have known about this kind of genre and perhaps would be another example of the transmission of useful knowledge?
Thank you, Marianne. Two other questions for Julia. One by Maarten Bruch, who also has a question for Raffaele Danna. I mean, his question is addressed to both of them, to Julia. No, is a separate question?
No, well, I have two different questions.
Two different questions. Then first question for Julia, and then afterwards I will invite you back, so you can come forward twice. If you don't bother.
Yes, thank you very much for the interesting paper. Just to be sure, my name is Maarten Bruch. I'm from Utrecht in the Netherlands, and I'll be impersonated later by Patrick Wallace when he presents our joint paper. My question is about the issue of secrecy versus advertisement. So, as I'm sure you are aware, there's a whole debate about these sort of texts, whether they were meant to cover up, as it were, knowledge, or whether they were trying to really share knowledge with the audience. And I wasn't sure where the two examples are that you are talking about. So my question really is, are these people advertising a design but covering up the technology that goes into the production of these weapons and armors? Or is there also something technical to be learned from these manuscripts that you've discussed? Thank you.
And then a final question for Julia comes from Jaco. Jaco, Zuiderdam, yes. Jaco, you always also has a separate question, or is it a joint question?
It's a separate one, yes.
Okay,
all right.
First for Julia.
Okay, thank you for a very interesting presentation, and this goes for all the presenters. My question follows up quite nicely with Martin's question, I would say. I was a bit struck by the fact that if you look at knights and armors, there is, of course, and you know, there's a medieval tradition of heralds who would have described knights and their armors, etc., which goes back, well, into the Middle Ages. And I was thinking whether the sources you have presented here today can be lumped together as sources that tell us something about technology, or whether this particular, what is it, Harnisch Muster book, which you showed with all the nice images, is also in part coming from a much older tradition where it is not so much about the technology, and Martin made this point as well. I mean, if you read this book, you would not be able probably to replicate this, but it's showing off perhaps. I am an important knight, and this is the armor I can afford, and I can ask a craftsman to make for me. And in that respect, it would connect much more to this older literature of heraldry books and the function of the herald in medieval society, showcasing the position and the achievements and abilities of a knight. So the question is the Harnisch Muster book a book on technology, or is it a book showcasing the users and what they could afford?
Okay, these were the questions for you, Julia. You can answer them now, treating them as a whole or picking up separately, as you please.
Okay. Thank you very much for your comments and your questions. I really like your comment on the cultural things that will be conveyed in the workshops, because I'm working on the theory of conventions and about conventions shape our world, and I think I have to put this theory much more in my paper, and I read your comment as an encouragement to do that. And yes, and thank you for your suggestion and your example from the 17th century, and maybe that is one reason that this harness model book is written, because they want to show what they can do and want to sell their products. So I think that can be taken into account. I will link to those questions, the last one about the, is this more showcasing for users, or can you, or is there informations about the techniques disseminated? And I think you can see both. And I'm not entirely sure what is the main topic of this manuscript, because, and I left this out in the presentation, you can see in the book there are beyond the figurine there are a lot of numbers written down, and they refer to how many pieces of the armor you need to build that armor which is shown in the figurine. And so there are much more information than only the advertisement of the harnesses and how they look like, and that you're not able to make a harness only from the book. But if you are able to make a harness, then you can maybe build them as a model. You can use them as a model, and this is much more evidentable in the second case study, where you can see those bells and how to found those bells and how to cast them and how to make those cranes and pulleys. When I show those manuscripts to my father, and he's a craftsman, then he said that you cannot learn to do this from the book, but you can learn some innovations from another crane, another how you put the rope for the pulley, and so that are books from masters for masters, and then not for apprenticeship, but for mastery. And we know those types of book not only from recipes, but from the architecture, from the 11th century onwards. And so I think we have to link these books with them. Okay, and the discussion about secrecy and publication, I read those texts, and I'm not sure if it is about secrecy. I have to think more about it. But what we have is that these writings, these manuscripts were handed down and spread. We found these manuscripts. And if you want to keep something secret, you shouldn't put it in a manuscript. So I started with my starting point was the sources and the rich material which is conveyed to us. So, yeah, thank you.
Yes, please. Yeah, but take the microphone, because otherwise we don't hear you. Very briefly, Martin.
Yeah.
Even the question was very brief. I mean.
So maybe what you could do in your paper is think more about what the unique selling point is that these authors want to get across. Is it new technical information, or is it indeed their innovative designs or information about the client? So sort of what are they claiming as their own? Yeah?
Yeah. It's a nice suggestion, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Nobody wants to add something or comment on this? No? Okay. Thank you, Julia, for your answers. We now come to the questions for Raffaele Danna, and I would like to start with the question by Richard Unger.
Thank you. Richard Unger from the University of British Columbia, Canada. Between 1275 and 1294, English customs duties were collected by the representatives of LIII's bankers. And that whether these collectors were English or not, the reports presumably went off to Italy with zeros in them. And from 1298 to the 1310s, again, in the 15 ports where these customs were collected, the collection was made by representatives of Italian bankers. Do you think, or do you have any evidence or suggestions that this had an impact on how merchants, who would have been the ones paying these taxes, how they kept their records, how they did their accounting? Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Another question for Raffaele comes from Marianne.
Marianne Kowaleski, Fordham University, New York City. So my question is, why was England so late to the game? Why, I mean, we're talking almost 2 centuries here, and the only reason that you kind of suggest are English-Italian tensions. But as Richard Unger has just noticed, there's huge precedent for the Italians being in a position to influence, you know, the exchequer, the collection of English customs at the local level, at Southampton. I know Philip has told me that a student of his had worked on Peterborough. There are examples in manorial administration, but you're right, it never completely takes hold. I'm wondering what's happening elsewhere in Europe in terms of this adoption. I mean, if you widen your comparative lens, does that help us answer the question about why England was so much later? So the Low Countries, northern France, what was the pace of their adoption? Was it similar to England in terms of its timing and the infiltration of the Italians, or was it different?
It was different. I can answer that as well. Then there is a question for Raffaele, also again from Maarten. Maarten, if you would come forward for the third time, you have to walk a lot of meters, yes?
Just stay here.
Okay.
No. Yeah, so I actually will sort of repeat Marian's question, but from a slightly different angle. So I really enjoyed your paper because, as the chair already said, Erik, you're connecting sort of big questions to very specific evidence. Yeah. But there's a problem in your comparison. And that is you're comparing two very similar cases, and on the basis of that, hinting at least at a certain causality. So I think you would enrich your comparison by looking at a very different case. And so France seemed to me an obvious example, because at first sight it's perhaps not as commercialized, whereas I would still expect a similar take-up of these mathematical procedures. But I'm just wondering if there's anything you can say about that.
Very intriguing question indeed, Maarten. And then there is a question from Marcus Denzel. Marcus, please.
Thank you very much. Marcus Denzel, Leipzig, Germany. Now I'm the third to have the same question as Marianne and Maarten now, but with another goal. My question is, can we assume that it was also a question, this lack, this delta of time, of the dissemination of commercial techniques the English merchants used? In other words, the Italians used the new numerals because it seemed to be necessary, useful for their practice of bookkeeping, exchanging, and insuring. But it seemed not to be necessary for the English merchants at the same time, and it became necessary as they were involved in these new commercial techniques. Could this be an explanation? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus. And then there is a question by Erik Aerts and Horii. Raffaele, I have a profound interest in the problem, of course, and I have been examining let's say, the spread and the diffusion process and the adoption process of Hindu-Arabic numerals in the Low Countries as well, not using, as you did, several handbooks and textbooks on arithmetics and mathematics, but using, let's say, the sources of everyday life, the accounts of public administrations and public officials and private individuals, so everyday bookkeeping. And I discovered, when examining this slow process of diffusion, to give you a hint, to give you a rough idea, Hindu-Arabic numerals appeared in public administration accounts only at the end of the 17th century, and in the course of the 18th century, even for large towns such as Bruch and Ghent and Brussels in the second half of the 18th century, so very, very late. But I discovered something interesting. Several stages, several phases in the adoption process. First, it started with chronological indications, so for the expressions of days and particularly of years, and almost at the same time for the indication, the numbering of pages or folios, pagination, foliation. And then, after considerable time lag, the new numerals were used to indicate figures. And then again, first in non-official accounts or preliminary drafts of accounts, and then finally, after again many decades, in the official formal presentation of the accounts. And even then, one notices a difference. First, the new numerals pop up in text lines, explaining and justifying the amounts in the right columns of the pages. And then finally, and very late, as I said, in public administrations, only in the 18th century, while private individuals such as merchants, brokers, bankers, already at 1500, which is rather late as well, I suppose. Well, only then these numerals find their place in official figures at the right margin and in the summa summarum. So different stages. And I wonder, did you discover more or less the same pattern in accounts in England and Italy, or was it completely different? Thank you so much in advance. I don't think so. Okay, you can answer that, please.
Thank you very much to all of these questions, which I think give me the opportunity to expand a little bit on what I have been doing during this PhD, and also to share that the PhD thesis is going to be published as a monograph with Harvard University Press, which hopefully should be out around this time next year. These are all very good questions. I see where they're coming from and where they are hinting at. For port books, I mean, I'll try to address them in steps. For port books, I have looked at the ones, especially in Southampton, because I was reading diaries written by Florentines who were going around in the 15th century in that strange period where Florence had a sort of fleet of commercial galleys, and some of them were going to England, and I realized that they were always calling at Southampton. So I looked at that because I thought it was an interesting case, and there I found there is a very interesting port book by William Soper, which is from the middle of the 15th century, that is kept in Greenwich today, and that is a very early instance of a public account book, a port account book, where there are instances here and there of Hindu-Arabic numerals appearing, and it is an interesting case because there is a diary written by a Florentine, Luca di Tommaso degli Albizzi, I think it is, which is published in an interesting book on the Florentine galleys, which is edited by Mallet, I think. And that diary is very interesting because it has this very brief observation where the Florentine says that the English officials are keeping accounts as if they were Italian notaries, which to me sort of, it was a sort of an interesting observation. That was the moment where I started to look at Southampton, because a Florentine that looks at the way in which accounting is being done by English officials and compares it to notaries was a sort of an interesting thing for me. And it looked like it may have opened to the possibility of some kind of exchange in bookkeeping knowledge and bookkeeping techniques. So that is a very early instance, I think, of the appearance of Hindu-Arabic numerals in English official accounts. Which brings me to, I think, the last question of how should we think about the fact that Hindu-Arabic numerals appear in accounting sources? Because what is it doesn't mean that if an account book only shows Roman numerals, that the person who is writing and who is making the calculations that are behind the account book does not know how to use Arabic numerals, right? It may well be that the calculations are done with written reckoning, but then the numbers are transcribed down and recorded in Roman numerals. And again, since from my research, the impression that I had was that the early adopter was Italy and the late adopter was England, I focused on the beginning and on the end of my story, both because of this picture that I was getting from the manuals, because what I did, the core of my PhD work was trying to reconstruct what I call the European tradition of practical arithmetic. To do that, I collected a corpus of 1,300 manuscripts, manuals, which are both manuscript and printed, and I collected detailed information on them, and I can map them. So I can see when and where this kind of text was appearing, and after that I sort of managed to see that the appearance of these texts went together with the spread of vernacular schools of practical arithmetic, and this is something that we see in Germany, this is something that we see in France, especially in Lyon, which of course was becoming a very important center because of commercial fairs. We're talking about the 80s of the 15th century. Lyon is a very interesting case because it starts from manuscript sources, so it starts before the introduction of the printing press. Schools appear immediately before the introduction of the printing press, and then the printing press makes everything explode. So the circulation of this kind of stuff is massively accelerated by the printing press. Then it moves slowly towards the northern part of the continent, reaches the Low Countries, and from the Low Countries it crosses the channel and gets to England. So I had this impression that Italy was the early mover, England the late adopter, so it made sense to just look at the beginning and at the end. Also because, of course, checking, you know, the account, the bookkeeping sources accounts for the entire period that I was covering was just impossible in the space of a PhD. But what I had the impression by looking at accounting sources in Italy and in England is that there is a change in what I call the social confidence in the new numbers. So also in Italy, in the beginning, there is a famous quote from the Arte del Cambio where theoretically, people who belong to the Arte del Cambio were prohibited from using Hindu-Arabic numerals in their accounts. But then if one looks at the actual accounts, it is clear that people are using them, and there is a progressive spread. They become more and more and more common as time goes by. In the 16th century, it is very common to find Hindu-Arabic numerals all over the place. But the way in which they start to circulate is different, right? My impression is that Roman numerals were considered as a sort of safer option because it is basically possible to close the number by drawing the final sign, which is an I or an X, with a long tail, right? So you're closing the number. And so this is why I'm saying that the real question that is really interesting is what methods were used to arrive at the numbers that then are recorded down, right? Because accounts are not reckoning documents, they are documents to record numbers. And what I saw both in Italy and in England is that the spread is exactly the one that you are describing, which I think is very, very interesting. So that the sort of new notation, the notation that can be tweaked by adding a 0 at the end and changing completely the number, appears first to record quantities and numbers that are not the core of the information that is recorded, right? So first they appear in page numbers, and this is the case for William Soper's account book, for the port account book from Southampton. They appear to, like number items in lists, then they appear to record years, then they appear to record elements that are in the entry but not in the final amounts, and at the very end they appear to record the final numbers. And I did this for Italy using a set of accounting sources, and for England I used probate inventories, which are the accounting sources that possibly make it possible to look at the widest social subset of the population. And what you see is really that, so I looked at that kind of documentation. I recorded when Hindu-Arabic numerals appeared, but I also looked at how they appear, so what kind of quantities are recorded there. And what one sees is that in the 17th century, as John Wallis was learning this kind of mathematics, so as this kind of mathematics was moving upwards the social ladder and was starting to influence academic practices, these numbers were also circulating in broader and broader social subset of the English population. I looked at inventories for carpenters, for example. And what one sees is that as John Wallis starts to look at this kind of stuff, carpenters are also starting to use these numbers in their accounts. So why not looking at France? I did look at France for Lyon. And Lyon is a very interesting case because one sees there is this move, the establishment of the fairs in Lyon. Lyon becomes quite quickly a key hub for European finance. There is this flood of Italian, Florentine, and German international merchants that arrive there, and that is quite a shock for the local mercantile community. There is a lament, for example, by a Lyon merchant who sort of calls on his son to learn this kind of new techniques. And what one sees, and this is quite similar for the south of Germany and for Lyon as well, is that starting from the second half of the 15th century, these things start to spread, these techniques start to spread among the local communities, that these merchants start to resort to the traditional institutions. So the very first people who are writing about this in the south of Germany and in Lyon, for example, are what used to be church masters, but that quite quickly that there is this sort of institutional influence, institutional fertilization, you could say. So quite quickly, after a generation of these sort of in-between figures, you start to have the lay masters who are actually teaching this kind of stuff. And you see a progressive movement towards north. On the question on why was that so late? It's a very interesting question. There is an argument that can be made ex silentio, essentially, the fact that there may have been some kind of practices of secrecy. Another possibility, which is the story that I try to reconstruct, is that following a suggestion by Cipolla, ideas travel on the legs of the humans, right? And that to learn this kind of stuff, it is not, and this also speaks to the observations that were made previously about the social and cultural practices that are entangled in the transmission of this kind of skills, that having a merchant who comes to London to do business is not enough for his knowledge to sort of spread around in the local society. And if you follow the tradition of European practical arithmetic, what you see is that these manuals appear in places of new adoption, between inverted commas, when a city, which most of the time means the local mercantile community, decides that they want to make an investment in an institution which makes the intergenerational transmission of this knowledge possible, which means founding a school and which means appointing a master who quite often comes from a place of previous adoption. The first masters that appear in the north of Italy, for example, come from Florence. I think that the very first ones are from the late 13th century, beginning of the 14th century. And what one sees is that, for example, among the very first masters that appear in the Low Countries, quite a lot of them have last names that are German sounding, so they could have moved from Germany. And this goes on. For England, it is quite clear because the first practical arithmetic manuals are based on continental sources, and because English merchants tell us that London was full of foreigners who were teaching these kind of things and who were possibly coming from across the channel. So why was it so late? I think is a question that is, why was it so slow? I think is a question that is very difficult to disentangle. But as we have seen, accounting sources suggest that the spread was really quite slow. And I think that, well, I try to say that following this mathematical tradition is a way to have a sort of proxy for much wider social and cultural phenomena that were happening and that were indeed quite slow and possibly surprisingly slow to develop. And this goes back to the hypothesis that I was trying to present about, are we looking at a very slow innovation cycle, which is the sort of provocation that I presented. And in terms of necessary useful, I think, and I'm coming, and I'm about to close to Denzel's question, which I think is key, in what will be the book, there is a sort of theoretical argument that is about the inherent characteristics of the new system. And there are, of course, several different differences between the Roman numerals, calculation with a counter abacus, with a reckoning table, and calculations with written calculation and Hindu Arabic numerals. First of all, to be able to reckon with Hindu Arabic numerals, a society needs to make a quite important investment in, for example, literacy, right? Because these numbers appear when merchants start to read and write, because you need to be able to write down these calculations. It is not absolutely compulsory, but it does move together with the ability of keeping track of one's techniques. But I think that that a key element of difference was the fact that Hindu Arabic numerals were introduced into Europe together with the notation that we still use for fractions. And the notation for fractions was really something different from what Roman numerals could provide. And with the notation with fractions, it is possible to handle rational numbers and to represent rational numbers in a way that previous systems, of course, made it possible, but they made it much more cumbersome, or at least this is the argument that I use. And if you want to do business on exchange rates, for example, and you're using very slight differences in the value of coins and the value of your units of account, you really need to have a system that makes it possible to handle rational numbers in an efficient way. I will close here. I have seen that I have taken way too much time, so I apologize for this. And I thank you, of course, for your questions, and I'm very happy to keep chatting afterwards if you want.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Raffaele, for your additional explanation. So rich in details that it almost represents a second paper. Thank you so much. There are two questions but very interesting. Thank you. There are two questions for Dr. Horii. The first is one by Didier Boisseul. Didier, puis-je vous demander de vous avancer, de prendre place derrière le microphone et poser votre question directement à notre collègue?
Grazie. Didier Boisseul, Università di Tours. Farò la domanda in italiano, lentamente.
I will ask the question in Italian. I want to know how was the judge commission, how was the judges commission? Because the judges had the opportunity to choose those who won the prize. What about the knowledge of these judges who gave the prize to the winners? And which elements they used to make a distinction, a selection of the winners in order to award the prize? So I want to know how the commission of judges was made of. Which way?
There's a second question by Jacob. Jacob,
please.
All right, Jacob Zadran, Lund University, Sweden. Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. My question is about the concrete techniques that were eventually awarded with these prizes, because I could imagine there might be two outcomes here. The one is that people were encouraged to come up with something entirely new and did so, but I could also imagine that they would simply use a technique that they knew from elsewhere and introduced that to Saxony. So my question is, this whole system with these prizes, did it generate true innovation and invention, or was it a device that contributed to, the dissemination of ideas that existed already elsewhere in Europe, or perhaps even contributed to industrial espionage?
And thank you for your comments. And first one, maybe we distinguish the, maybe I distinguish the winners as like two aspects. Like one is, the one is for the real workers in textile industry, and not workers in textile industries. I mean, you said the judge or some political officers or some merchants. So in the first one, in the textile industries workers, maybe this one is for the improvement of technologies, but yes, judges and merchants or public officers is difficult one, but actually for the officers and judges, actually they did not do the productive activity. Like they achieved some spread of silkworm seeds for silk production. Like yes, and some gardeners own some land for grow mulberry trees for feed silkworms. So yeah, they are the, maybe I should distinguish them, but yeah, it's a difficult, maybe for judges and public officers, maybe which is not knowledge diffusions, yes. But yeah, I concentrated on the prize competitions. I listed the winners of prize. So yeah, maybe I should cut the. I should not demonstrate the prize winners, which is not engaged in textile industry. But yeah, this is a achievement. So yeah, it's a difficult question. So yeah, just judges, judges are not did not contribute to the textile technology diffusions, but yeah, they contributed. How can I say? just textile industry development. So maybe I should discuss in the differently. So yes. Maybe I should rewrite the papers. Okay, next one is concrete technologies. And yeah, actually the previous studies said price competitions or price premium or like some economic policies promote innovations, but I don't think so. Maybe innovation is very difficult, or like innovation should, yeah, in the how can I say, innovation, it's like inventions like in textile industry, but yes, to understand the industrialization in 19th century, maybe I should focus on the 18th century, because textile industry, in the textile industries, the quality of textile goods was changed and improved in the 18th century. And but yeah, previous studies only said quality was improved at that time. And yeah, this is not innovations, but small inventions or small innovations. And yeah, in the 18th century, actually the Jenny spinning machine was introduced from Britain, or yeah, maybe the France or Italy. Spinning Jenny was introduced, but in the prize competitions, spinning Jenny was not mentioned. And but the government gave the money to the inventor of the spinning jenny in Saxony. So, but in previous studies, the giving money economic policy was not distinguished. Actually, the Saxon government implemented two kinds of economic policy to give money. One is a prize competition. The other is premium, giving a premium. Premium one is to give up money to the prominent figure or famous technician in Saxony, like I said in the Irmscher or Volker or Matthias Frey. They achieved the improvement or introducing the spinning jenny or spinning mill machines. So yeah, that is like innovations in Saxony or huge invention in Saxony. So this can be the innovations, but this is not through the prize competitions. So maybe prize competition is not innovation, but for the improvement or like maybe really small inventions. Like I mean, yeah, I discussed what is achieved in the previous papers. Actually, these achievement is very tiny one, like the improvement of, okay, the thread is really thin, or like the textile is really high quality or thin textiles. So this is not huge innovations in the history of textile industry. So yes, but yeah. Importing the new technology or new quality of the textile in Saxony. So it's a difficult question. So yeah, it's okay. That's all. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Then we come to the questions for the last speaker of this morning session. We have two questions for Dr. Heinrich Lang. The first one is by Francesco Guidi Bruscoli. Francesco. And the second one is by Marcus Denzel.
Thank you. Francesco Guidi Bruscoli from the University of Florence, nearby. So I have two questions for Heinrich Lang. Thank you for your paper. You start your analysis of the case studies of Matteo Brandolini from book B, so Libro di Debitori e Creditori. B clearly is the second letter of the alphabet. So my first question is the book A, so the one preceding it, still extant? And if so, who is keeping it? Is it Alemanno himself? Is it another proxy? And in either case, I think it would be interesting to see the differences, whether there are differences in the way it is kept. Clearly, if it has disappeared, there is nothing you can do about it. Second question refers to your conclusion, where you imply, or maybe you state actually, that the emergence of these experts is stimulated by diversification. I wonder whether you can expand that and maybe reflect on additional possible explanations. For example, the detachment of the, let's call it patron, I don't know, from direct management, so from the direct involvement in the business administration. Or, for example, the clearer separation of management of personal accounts, so the accounts of the state, and business accounts. And also, for example, did you have the chance to look at other contemporary books you can compare them with? Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco. A very brief answer, perhaps, Heinrich?
I'm waiting for Marcus
yes,
Denzel.
Yeah, okay, so better. Sorry, Marcus.
Thank you very much, Heinrich, for your inspiring paper. And you discussed the question if Brandolini was a typical bookkeeper of his time or an outstanding accounting manager. And so my question is, may we really speak of a new type of accountant, as you did in your written version, an accounting manager, may say? And if yes, what was this a general phenomenon, or can we find such persons only in single cases in 16th century Italy? Thank you very much.
Shall I do? Right. Thank you, Francesco, for your questions, which I like very much. The first interesting thing about Alemanno Salviati is that his full account books series are preserved in the Salviati archives. So it's clearly possible to make, the first step is to identify all his scribes, accountants, and so on, and then the change over time and between all these. And I highlighted today the most prominent figure I have been identifying, which is Matteo Brandolini, and we have the difference between the ledger B and A, and then when he proceeds to the ledger C, it obviously arrives at the level of an enterprise. And my question was, why did Alemanno Salviati have account books as if he were an enterprise? And one of the explanations I came across was that when the change of the accountant took place, the whole system was modified. It is not like a huge step, but it's like small steps, one after another. And of course, the key question is the comparison. Is this a single case? Is it just something like being blind towards others? And of course, I have to study in future, like all these, say, personal account books of the Florentine patricians, like Quaratesi and so on, Bartolini, which are preserved in various archives, to make the comparison about all these accountants or scribes or secretaries. The problem is that none of the other account book series is as complete as the series preserved for Alamanno Salviati. So this makes it very difficult to say a full comparison. And about Marcus, my answer is, as far as I can see, this phenomenon might be limited to Italy, to Tuscany. But if I take Matthäus Schwarz in the same period, even in Germany, in South Germany, we are able to observe that the figure of the expert accountant appears in a certain way in a high-profile position. So it might be a tendency which evolves in accounting in general, in Europe, say. The interesting case about Matteo Brandolini is that we are speaking about a personal accountant. Alamanno did not run an enterprise, did not run a compagnia. So we are talking about someone who is like the personal secretary and a personal accountant. But what I don't know is the difference between Matteo Brandolini and his master. I don't know, well, his master was raised up in Rome. He was not raised up in the Florentine context. So I cannot be very sure about his formation, about his education. And I only know that Alamanno Salviati was quite integrated in the layer of merchant bankers of his time, because in one of his letters, two of his letters, he mentioned that he spoke to his cousins who were active managers of, directors of their companies. So we know that Alamanno, the master of Matteo Brandolini, himself did have knowledge, economic knowledge, but I'm not sure how far that went with accounting. And this was why I tried to highlight this figure of the personal accountant to open a debate on the question.
Thank you, Heidi. And finally, we have a final question, more of a general nature, a general consideration coming from Renzo Sabatini, related to all the papers of this morning.
Renzo Sabatini, insegno
Renzo Sabatini, I teach modern history at Siena University. I have no single or specific question. I have been listening to all the questions with the utmost interest, and I really would like to congratulate you for all these presentations. But I would like to say something in general terms about the whole morning and maybe the whole day. It's a linguistic issue. I might be very sensitive, or maybe even too much, to the Italian translation of the useful knowledge, the word useful knowledge. I know what this expression means, but if I remember, it goes back to 20 years ago. If I remember Emokir, how Emokir was using this expression, if we wanted to translate it into Italian, it was knowledge applied to productive processes, which was definitely changing, but not much. It was changing the trilogy, the older trilogy of the economic historians, up to Cipolla, until Cipolla. The university, the science, technique, and economic innovation. Okay, the translation into Italian, useful knowledge. I don't like that, actually, because this brings to my mind some unuseful knowledge or unuseful. And since we see, at least in Italy, but I think that the same applies globally, we see that even in the field of research, there is an overestimation of applied research vis-à-vis basic research, as compared with basic research, especially for us, because we usually deal with humanities, and it is even more evident. So I would prefer either leaving knowledge as a translation, because translating practical or applied, this would probably lead to some dichotomy, which, it is a very strange, it's very difficult to understand, because where does this all come from? Where does applied knowledge come from? We have to ask ourselves this. It is not created as an applied research. It comes from some knowledge, which is unuseful knowledge. So probably, knowledge and its diffusion. I think that this should be, it is the right title for our day together, because practical and theoretical, I think this dichotomy is wrong. The presentations in the morning showed that and proved that. It is very different. It is very diverse. All these presentations have been very interesting, but, for example, marmor or bell casting as compared with arithmetics applied to mercantile accounts, or more in general, to all arithmetics in general. So I think it could be both theoretical and practical. So I would like to, it is like an appeal. I suggest we should not be using this expression, useful knowledge, conoscenza utile. I don't like this definition. It is a very interesting explanation following linguistics. Thank you. Anyone else? Anyone wishing to answer the question or the general remark? Maybe someone who is very familiar with the Italian language.
Mi permetto di rispondere.
I would like to reply. I very much liked your presentation, Professor Sabatini. Thank you very much. My remark is the following. Before the time of academia, we didn't have this separation between the different kinds of knowledge. What we see, especially if we combine the presentation, this morning presentations, is that we have this development in the use of Hindu-Arab numerals that are using differently. And we also see that in the practice of that time, merchants or accountant merchants did use these figures. And we have the state of the art. And then the law say do not use Hindu-Arabic numerals. You should be using the Roman numerals because from a legal viewpoint, they are more important and they can be tested better. this is part of the topic we went into in the morning. But then there is one more thing which I made my hypothesis. Why? Because I was wondering, how did they learn the knowledge of the habits of the knowledge in the banking setting and in the trading or in the commercial setting? Through letters, because they would create a sort of community through letters. And before the elementary school, that was a knowledge already, without the separation, the theoretical separation and applied separation. There was no such difference. And then I think it is our own problem. We know that the authors, the esteemed authors like Kuznet or Joël Moikier, they have introduced the idea of useful knowledge, because they themselves were trying to set and to speak about enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment in general, against Catholicism, Christianity. But in our society, in the Christian society of the 14th, 15th, or 16th century, there is no such problem.
And so allow me to check briefly whether there are questions coming in the chat box from our colleagues who are attending our meeting on the screen. Non ci sono domande?
Do you have any questions to answer in the chat box? So we have no questions in the chat box. So good.
I can safely conclude this first session of our Settimana by thanking the authors for their presentations and for their fine papers, and of course also the colleagues who were involved into the discussion. Thank you, the audience, for your attendance, your patience, and your interest. Please do enjoy your lunch in one of the many nice restaurants in Prato. Buon appetito, ci vediamo dopo alle 3 questo pomeriggio.
Enjoy lunch. We meet once again this afternoon 3 sharp. Enjoy your lunch. Bye.